April 1944. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The air thick with magnolia and defeat. Dr. Klaus Hartmann stood in the processing line, prisoner number chalked across his chest, still believing the Fuhrer would turn it all around. He'd spent 25 years designing weapons for the Reich, crafting each rifle like a work of art, slow and precise and perfect. Then Captain Mitchell drove him north to Rock Island Arsenal, and Klaus saw something that made his blood run cold. Not tanks, not bombs, just a simple pistol. The modified M1911, rolling off assembly lines at 400 per day, every part interchangeable, every worker, men, women, black, white, stamping their initials with pride, not fear. One girl hummed while she worked. Klaus had built his guns with terror and genius. America built theirs with hope and assembly lines. In that moment, staring at that blunt, unstoppable pistol, Klaus knew the truth his propaganda had hidden. They'd already lost. But if you want to hear more incredible untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's fascinating to see how far these stories travel. The spring air hit Klaus Hartmann like a wall the moment they unloaded him from the truck. April in Mississippi carried a sweetness he'd never known. Magnolia blossoms and cut grass and something else, something he couldn't name. Not the cordite that had stained his clothes for years, not the coal dust that had settled into the cracks of his hands at the Oberndorf factory. This was different. This smelled like peace, and it made his stomach turn. He stood in the processing line at Camp Shelby, prisoner number 4477, chalked on a board hanging from his neck by a length of twine. Around him, other German soldiers shuffled forward in their filthy uniforms, faces blank with exhaustion and shame. Klaus kept his back straight. Temporary, he told himself. The Fuhrer had turned things around before. Stalingrad had been a setback, yes, but Germany had the best engineers, the most advanced weapons, the superior will. This surrender in North Africa was tactical, strategic, not defeat. He watched the American guards laugh with each other near the fence line, sharing cigarettes like schoolboys between classes. Sloppy, undisciplined. One had his helmet tilted back, another had his rifle slung over his shoulder like an afterthought. Klaus filed it away in his mind, more evidence of a soft enemy. These were the soldiers who thought they could break the Reich? These boys who looked like they'd never missed a meal, never truly suffered? The guard at the processing table barely looked up. "Next," he said, his accent thick and slow. Klaus stepped forward. The guard checked his papers, made a mark in a ledger, then waved him through. No interrogation, no violence, just bureaucracy, American style, efficient and indifferent. But then something shifted. An officer approached, consulted briefly with the processing guard, and pulled Klaus out of the line. "Engineers," the officer said to someone Klaus couldn't see. "Might be useful." Klaus felt a spike of fear, then forced it down. Whatever they wanted, he would give them nothing. The Hague Convention protected him. He was a civilian contractor, not military. They couldn't force him to betray his country. They took him to a different barracks away from the main prisoner compound. The building was clean, almost comfortable. Real bunks with mattresses, not straw. Windows with glass that wasn't shattered. A young corporal, barely old enough to shave, brought him soap and a razor. Real soap, not the caustic lye they'd been using at the end. Klaus held it to his nose. It smelled like lavender, like his wife's garden before the war. The corporal returned an hour later with a tin cup. "Coffee, sir," he said, and the word "sir" landed wrong in Klaus's ears. He was a prisoner. Why would this boy call him sir? Klaus reached for the cup and his hand shook. He hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, maybe 3. Time had blurred somewhere over the Atlantic. The corporal noticed the tremor and, without a word, steadied the cup in Klaus's grip. He didn't say anything, didn't mock him, just held the cup steady until Klaus could drink, then nodded once and left. For a moment, sitting there with a real coffee warming his empty stomach, Klaus thought maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe the Americans, for all their softness, weren't cruel. Maybe he could wait out the war here, in this clean barracks, and go home when Germany's inevitable victory came. Then Captain Mitchell entered. He was older than the other soldiers Klaus had seen, maybe 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes. He didn't offer pleasantries. He dropped a manila folder on the small table between them and opened it without ceremony. Inside were technical schematics, German weapons reports, interrogation transcripts. Klaus recognized some of the documents. They were his. "You're Dr. Klaus Hartmann," Mitchell said. It wasn't a question. "Mauser Werke. You designed the Kar 98K bolt improvement in 41, signed off on the STG-44 prototypes. We have 3 different intelligence reports confirming it." Klaus said nothing. His training, such as it was, told him to stay silent. "Give them nothing to work with." Mitchell leaned forward. His voice stayed level, almost conversational. "Here's how this works," he said. "You consult on captured German weapons. You tell us what you know, technical details, manufacturing weaknesses, design flaws, nothing political, nothing that violates the conventions. Just engineering. In exchange, you get regular Red Cross letters, maybe news about your boy." The room tilted. Hans. Klaus hadn't heard his son's name spoken aloud in 9 months. Not since the letter that said Hans had been transferred to the Eastern Front, somewhere near Minsk. Not since the silence that followed. Mitchell watched him carefully. "We know you have a son," he continued. "Wehrmacht. 18th Panzer Grenadier, last known position in Belorussia. If he's alive, if he's been captured or wounded, the Red Cross will know eventually. But that information doesn't come free, Dr. Hartmann. Nothing does." Klaus found his voice. "And if I refuse?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. The friendliness, thin as it was, disappeared. "Then you sit in a cell and wonder if he's alive while this war drags on another year. Another 2 years. However long it takes. Your choice." He stood, collected the folder, and walked to the door. "I'll give you tonight to think about it," he said without turning around. "Tomorrow morning we start." The door closed. Klaus sat alone in the quiet barracks, staring at his reflection in the window glass. The prisoner number was still chalked across his chest. His own face looked back at him like a stranger's, thinner than he remembered. Older. Defeated. Outside, someone was mowing grass. The smell drifted through the window, sweet and ordinary. An American smell. A peacetime smell. Klaus closed his eyes and saw Hans as a boy, 7 years old, helping him in the workshop, asking endless questions about gears and leverage and how things fit together. Before the party. Before the uniforms. Before Klaus had believed that engineering for the Reich was patriotic duty instead of damnation. He hadn't been betrayed by the Americans. He'd been betrayed by his own pride. The war wasn't over. Not for Germany, and not for him. And now he had to choose which cost more, his loyalty to a government that had sent his son to die in a frozen wasteland, or his chance to hear that Hans was still breathing somewhere in this broken world. They came for Klaus the next morning before dawn. Corporal Hayes brought him coffee again, still calling him sir, still treating him like a consultant rather than a prisoner. The cognitive dissonance made Klaus's head ache. He'd been trained to expect cruelty or indifference. This quiet respect felt like a trap, though he couldn't identify the mechanism. Mitchell drove them across base in a jeep as the sun broke over the pine trees. They pulled up to a converted warehouse, unremarkable except for the guards posted at the entrance. Inside, the space opened into something Klaus hadn't expected. A proper workshop. Workbenches lined the walls, each equipped with precision tools that would have made his colleagues at Mauser weep with envy. And scattered across every surface, like artifacts in a museum of his own failure, were German weapons. Lugers still crusted with sand from North Africa. MP-40 submachine guns with their stocks splintered. Panzerfausts, some fired, some not. A damaged MG-42 machine gun lay disassembled on a central table, its parts arranged with almost surgical care. American engineers in shirt sleeves moved between the weapons, measuring, photographing, taking notes. No one looked up when Klaus entered. They just kept working. Mitchell introduced him to the team. 3 men, 1 woman. No one saluted. No one spat at him either. They just nodded, acknowledged his presence like he was any other specialist brought in for consultation, and returned to their work. The woman was examining a Luger's toggle mechanism under a magnifying lamp. She glanced at Klaus briefly, her expression neutral, then went back to her notes. "We need to know why the STG-44 jams in cold weather," Mitchell said flatly, walking Klaus to a workbench where one of the revolutionary assault rifles lay partially disassembled. "Your Mauser team designed the gas system. We've got field reports from the Eastern Front the weapon fails below freezing. Consistently. We need to know if it's a design flaw or a manufacturing shortcut." Klaus crossed his arms. His heart hammered, but he kept his voice steady. "I signed the Hague Convention. I don't have to provide information that could be used against my country's military forces." Mitchell didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "You're right. You don't." Then he walked to a large map pinned to the warehouse wall. Red pins marked battles, dozens of them. Klaus recognized the names: Monte Cassino, Anzio, the Gustav Line, and there in pencil, dated soon, one word: Normandy. Mitchell stood in front of the map with his back to Klaus. "Every day you sit quiet, someone's son doesn't come home. Maybe yours, maybe mine." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, gone thin and tight. "Actually, definitely mine." Klaus looked at him, really looked. Mitchell's uniform hung loose on his frame like he'd lost weight recently. The skin around his wedding ring was pale, a band of untanned flesh that suggested the ring had been tighter once. His eyes, when he finally turned around, were hollowed out underneath, dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and letters that would never be answered. Hayes appeared at Klaus's elbow, quiet as a ghost. He placed a technical manual on the workbench. "Sir, I can get you coffee while you work," he said softly. "Just say the word." Klaus stared at the manual. It was in German. They'd found a German military technical manual somewhere, probably pulled from a captured supply depot, and they were offering it to him like it was a courtesy. His hands remembered this: the weight of blueprint paper, the smell of machine grease and gun oil, the particular texture of engineering schematics under his fingertips. For just a moment he was back in Oberndorf before the war, when engineering meant precision and innovation, not death counts and production quotas enforced by men in black uniforms. He opened the manual, found the section on the STG-44 gas system, and slowly, haltingly, he started talking. Just the facts. Clinical observations, the gas port diameter, the piston tolerance, the quality of the steel they'd been forced to use when the good chromium ran out. He told himself it was strategic, that he was only sharing what the Americans would discover eventually through testing, that he wasn't betraying anything that mattered. But part of him, a part he didn't want to examine too closely, felt like he was breathing again, like he was doing real work instead of just surviving. The engineers listened, asked clarifying questions, took notes. The woman with the Luger looked up at one point and asked him about the toggle mechanism's spring tension. He answered. She nodded, made an adjustment, tested it. It worked. She thanked him. No one treated him like a traitor. No one treated him like a prisoner. They just treated him like an engineer who knew things they needed to know. It was profoundly disturbing, and somehow, impossibly, it felt right. Mitchell brought him lunch, a real lunch, sandwiches and fruit and more coffee. They ate at the workbench, surrounded by the disassembled weapons of Klaus's homeland. Mitchell asked him about the manufacturing process at Mauser, the quality control, the inspections. Klaus answered, carefully at first, then with more detail. He wasn't revealing military secrets. He was describing factory processes, industrial procedures. It felt like a safe line to walk. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was how the inspections had changed, how the SS had started posting guards in the factory, how workers had been shot for errors, for asking questions, for working too slowly, how the brilliant engineers he'd trained with had started disappearing, arrested for defeatism when they pointed out that the production quotas were mathematically impossible. How fear had seeped into every decision, every calculation, until they weren't building the best weapons anymore. They were building whatever kept them alive another day. That evening, back in his barracks, Klaus lay on his bunk and listened to the distant sound of machinery. Something was always running on an American military base. Always building, always moving. The metallic click of rifle bolts being tested echoed from the warehouse. It was the sound of problems being solved, of engineering done right, without terror breathing down your neck. He thought about Hans, wondered if his son was warm tonight, wondered if he had enough food, wondered if he was even alive to wonder about. And Klaus realized with a sick certainty that if his cooperation here shortened the war by even a single day, it might mean Hans survived. It might mean some American boy survived too. Some other father might get to keep his son. He closed his eyes, told himself he was doing this strategically. For Hans, for Germany's future, whatever that meant now. But the truth sat heavy in his chest. He was doing it because for the first time in years, someone had treated him like his expertise mattered more than his loyalty. Like his knowledge was valuable not for building better ways to kill, but for understanding how and why things worked. And that small distinction, that tiny shift in purpose, had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was sealed forever. A week passed in the rhythm of work and careful conversation. Klaus spent his days in the warehouse, examining captured weapons, answering technical questions, slowly learning that cooperation didn't have to mean surrender. Then, on a Tuesday morning, Mitchell appeared at his barracks earlier than usual with a different kind of purpose in his expression. "Get dressed," Mitchell said. "We're taking a drive." Klaus felt the old fear spike in his chest. A drive could mean anything: interrogation at a different facility, transfer to a harsher camp, the kind of drive people didn't return from. But Hayes was there too, carrying Klaus's jacket, and the young corporal's face showed nothing but his usual quiet kindness. Klaus decided to trust that, or at least trust that he had no other choice. They drove north for 2 hours through countryside that looked nothing like Germany. The land here was flat and green, the roads wide and smooth. Mitchell said little during the drive, just stared out the window with that haunted look he got sometimes, the one that made Klaus think of Hans and wonder if all fathers of soldiers wore their grief the same way regardless of which flag they served. When they finally pulled through a guarded gate, Klaus saw the sign, Rock Island Arsenal, Illinois. He'd heard of it, read about it in intelligence briefs back when he still believed those briefs mattered. One of America's primary small arms manufacturing plants. He'd expected a factory. What he saw instead stopped the breath in his throat. The noise hit him first as they walked through the main entrance. Not the sound of a factory, but of an industrial cathedral. Stamping presses hammered in synchronized rhythm. Milling machines whirred. The clank and hiss of assembly lines stretched hundreds of yards in every direction. And everywhere, workers. Thousands of them, men and women, white and black, young and old, moving in orchestrated precision like musicians in some vast mechanical symphony. Mitchell led him to an observation deck overlooking the main production floor, and there, spread below them like a revelation, was the M1911 line. Not one assembly station. Dozens. Workers stationed every few feet, each performing a specific task, each piece flowing from one station to the next in relentless progression. A foreman walked the line, pulled a pistol at random, and held it up. Then he pulled another from 3 stations down the line, and in front of Klaus's disbelieving eyes began swapping parts between the 2 weapons. The barrel from one pistol fit perfectly into the frame of the other. The slide, the trigger assembly. Every component was interchangeable. The foreman reassembled both weapons, test-fired them into a sand trap, and sent them back down the line. The whole demonstration took less than 3 minutes. Klaus's chest tightened. His hands gripped the railing. At Mauser, they hand-fitted parts. Every rifle was slightly unique, each one requiring skilled craftsmen to file and adjust until the pieces married correctly. It was beautiful work, precise. A matter of pride. But it was slow. So painfully slow, and it required expertise that took years to develop, expertise that was dying in bombed factories and frozen trenches. Here, they were making 400 M1911 pistols per day. Per day! From this one facility. And Mitchell had mentioned there were others. Mitchell handed Klaus one of the pistols fresh off the line, still warm from testing. Modified model, he said quietly. Updated feed ramp, tighter tolerances, Parkerized finish to prevent corrosion. We're putting these in the hands of every officer heading to France next month. Klaus turned the weapon over in his hands. The machining was flawless. Clean lines, no tool marks, every edge precisely chamfered. He thought of the Lugers they'd made at Mauser. Elegant, yes, beautiful, certainly, but expensive, temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and skilled armorers to keep them functioning. This American pistol was blunt, simple, and utterly unstoppable. A weapon that would work when you needed it to work, that any soldier could maintain, that could be dropped in mud or sand and still fire. "How many of these do you make?" Klaus asked. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. Mitchell's expression was unreadable. "Enough." Then he paused, choosing his words carefully. "The question isn't how many guns we make, Doctor. It's how fast we can make them with how many different hands from how many different factories, all making the exact same part." Klaus watched a young woman, maybe 18 years old, install a firing pin. She worked with quick, practiced efficiency, 11 seconds from start to finish. Then she stamped her initials on a small inspection tag, attached it to the pistol, and sent it down the line. And she was humming. Actually humming some tune Klaus didn't recognize. She didn't look afraid, didn't look coerced. She looked proud. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He thought of the German factories he knew, the ones in Oberndorf and Suhl and Berlin, thought of them running on 12-hour shifts with workers who were terrified, exhausted, starving. Thought of the slave laborers brought in from Poland and Russia, beaten for working too slowly, shot for sabotage, real or imagined. Thought of the engineers who disappeared after questioning production quotas. Thought of the SS inspectors who cared more about ideological purity than manufacturing efficiency. These Americans were singing while they worked. Mitchell walked him through other sections, the quality control stations where every 10th pistol was fully disassembled and measured, the training area where new workers learned their specific task, usually in less than a day, the break room where workers sat eating lunch, laughing, reading letters from home. No guards, no one watching to make sure they worked fast enough. Just people doing a job they believed in for wages that let them feed their families in a system that valued their contribution. On the drive back to Camp Shelby, Klaus sat in silence. Mitchell didn't push him to talk, just let him process what he'd seen. But the images wouldn't leave Klaus's mind. That young woman humming, the interchangeable parts, the scale of it all. The simple, devastating efficiency of a system built on standardization rather than artisanship, on trust rather than fear, on the revolutionary idea that ordinary people, properly trained and fairly treated, could build anything. That night in his barracks, Klaus couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and did the mathematics in his head. 400 pistols per day from one facility. How many facilities did America have? How many assembly lines making rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces? How many factories that could shift from making automobiles to making tanks, from making washing machines to making shell casings? Germany had brilliant engineers. Klaus knew this. He was one of them. They had technical superiority in many areas. Better tanks, better aircraft designs, more advanced weapon systems. But brilliance didn't matter if you couldn't produce it at scale. Genius didn't matter if your factories were rubble and your workforce was dying. America didn't have better engineers. They had better systems, and people who wanted to make those systems work. The thought settled into Klaus's bones like radiation, invisible and inescapable. He'd spent years believing in German superiority, technical prowess, the triumph of will and intellect, but he'd just seen something that made all of that irrelevant. He'd seen the future, and it was a teenage girl stamping her initials on a firing pin with pride, knowing her name would go to France with that pistol, knowing her work mattered, knowing she was building victory one small part at a time. And she was doing it without anyone holding a gun to her head. The veil had torn. Klaus could feel it. Not completely, not yet, but enough to let in a sliver of terrible light. Enough to make him question everything he'd believed about how wars were won, about what made nations strong, about whether the Reich he'd served had ever understood what true power looked like. It looked like standardization, like trust, like a girl who hummed while she worked because she believed in what she was building. 2 weeks after the Arsenal visit, Klaus found himself working late in the warehouse workshop. Most of the other engineers had gone home for the evening, leaving just him and Mitchell at the workbenches under the hanging lights. The relationship between them had shifted in ways Klaus couldn't quite name. Not friendship exactly, but something closer to mutual respect between two men who'd both lost too much to pretend the masks still fit. Klaus had been helping, really helping. He'd shown them the MG-42's feed mechanism flaw, the weakness in the tolerance that caused jamming when the barrel heated unevenly. He'd advised on panzer armor composition, explaining why the late-war steel was brittle, prone to spalling. He told himself it was about ending the war faster. Maybe saving Hans, maybe saving everyone's sons. But deeper than that, underneath the rationalizations, it felt like penance. Like maybe if he helped dismantle the machine he'd helped build, some part of his soul might survive intact. Hayes appeared in the doorway carrying a tin box, his expression shy. "My mama sent cookies," he said, offering it to them both. "She bakes for the church bake sales back home, but she always sends extra for the boys here." Klaus took one, surprised by the gesture. The cookie was still soft, rich with butter and brown sugar and vanilla. The taste hit him like memory made solid. His mother had baked cookies like this when he was a boy, before the First War, before everything broke. He had to look away, blinking hard. "Your mother bakes for prisoners?" Klaus asked when he trusted his voice again. Hayes smiled, that quiet smile that made him look even younger than his 19 years. "She bakes for anybody who's hungry, sir. That's just how she is. Says everybody's somebody's son." After Hayes left, Mitchell and Klaus sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm, eating cookies that tasted like a world neither of them lived in anymore. Then Mitchell reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. He laid it on the workbench between them without ceremony. The young man in the picture was maybe 22, wearing an army uniform, holding a rifle, trying to smile at the camera but not quite managing it. He had Mitchell's eyes. The same tired determination. "My son," Mitchell said quietly. "Tommy." Klaus looked at the face, really looked, tried to see the person instead of just another soldier. The freckles across his nose, the cowlick in his hair that the army barber hadn't quite tamed, the wedding ring on his finger that meant somewhere a young woman was waiting, hoping, not knowing yet that hope was already a memory. "Anzio," Mitchell continued. "Sniper got him in January. They said he didn't suffer." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What the hell does that mean? How do they know? Were they there when the bullet hit? Did they ask him?" Klaus reached into his own pocket. His hand shook slightly as he pulled out a creased photograph, worn soft at the edges from being touched too many times. Hans, in his Wehrmacht uniform, standing at attention, trying to look brave, trying to look like a man. But Klaus could still see the boy underneath, could see the son who'd wanted to study literature, who'd read poetry in 3 languages, who'd enlisted because his father had pushed him toward proving something neither of them could articulate. "Eastern Front," Klaus said. "Near Minsk. Last letter was in December. Nothing since." Mitchell looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at Klaus. 2 fathers. 2 sons. The space between them suddenly felt smaller than the ocean that separated their countries, smaller than the ideologies that had sent their boys to die. "I used to think," Klaus started, then stopped. The words felt dangerous, like speaking them aloud would make something irreversible. But Mitchell was waiting, not pushing, just present. and Klaus found he needed to say it. I used to think we were fighting for something pure, order, strength, building a nation that would last 1,000 years. The Führer said we were creating the future. He stopped again, stared at his hands, hands that had designed weapons, signed production orders, approved modifications that made guns more efficient at killing, hands that had held Hans as a baby, taught him to tie his shoes, shook with fury during their last argument about duty and honor and what a father owed his country. I don't know what we're building anymore, Klaus said finally, but you're building this. He gestured at the workshop, at the tools, at the honest work of understanding how things functioned. You build things that work, and people want to build them. That girl at the arsenal humming while she installed firing pins. In our factories, workers are afraid. Here they're proud. Mitchell nodded slowly. It's not perfect here, Doctor. Not even close. We've got our own sins. Jim Crow laws, Japanese families in camps out west. A lot of folks who don't get treated like that girl at the arsenal, who don't get to feel proud of their work. But yeah, we try. We argue, we fail, and we try again. That's the difference, maybe. We're allowed to argue. For a moment, sitting there in the quiet workshop with the photographs of their sons between them, Klaus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the propaganda hope of inevitable victory or thousand-year empires. Real hope. Small and fragile and earned, hope that there was a world after this war, that he might find Hans alive, that they might rebuild something together, father and son, in the ashes of everything they'd believed. The feeling lasted maybe 30 seconds. The next morning, Hayes came to Klaus's barracks. His face was pale, his eyes red like he'd been crying or hadn't slept. Klaus knew before the young corporal said anything, knew from the way Hayes held the envelope, knew from the silence that stretched too long. Doc, Hayes said quietly, Captain Mitchell asked me to give you this. It was a Red Cross telegram forwarded through Geneva, stamped with official seals and dates. Klaus's hands trembled as he opened it. The words swam in his vision, but he forced himself to read them, forced himself to understand. Oberndorf destroyed. Allied bombing. March 1945. No survivors reported your address. His home. His workshop. The street where Hans had learned to ride a bicycle. The house where Klaus's wife had died of pneumonia 3 years ago, where her garden had grown wild because he couldn't bear to tend it. The neighbors who'd known him since childhood. The apprentices he'd trained. The foreman who'd worked beside him for 20 years. Gone. All of it. Erased in a single night by bombs dropped from planes designed by engineers like him, built in factories like the one Mitchell had shown him, loaded by workers who hummed while they worked because they believed in what they were building. Klaus sat down hard on his bunk. The room tilted. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd told himself he was protecting, everything that made him Klaus Hartmann of Oberndorf instead of just prisoner 4477. Ashes. All ashes. And somewhere in Russia, if Hans was even alive, he was fighting for a government that had let it all burn. Fighting for a Reich that would sacrifice everything, destroy everything, pull the whole world down into darkness rather than admit defeat. Hayes stayed with him. Didn't speak. Just sat on the adjacent bunk, present, bearing witness to grief that had no nationality. After a while, the young corporal pulled out a handkerchief, handed it to Klaus. It smelled like laundry soap and kindness. Klaus held the telegram in one hand and the photograph of Hans in the other. Outside, somewhere on the base, someone was working. The sound of hammers and machinery drifted through the window. America building. Always building. While his homeland consumed itself. The M1911 pistol Mitchell had given him to examine still sat on the small table in his barracks. Cold, precise, victorious. A weapon built by people who believed tomorrow would be better than today, who worked without fear, who stamped their names on their work because they were proud. Klaus looked at it and finally understood, not in his head, in his gut, in his bones, in the hollow space where his heart used to be. They'd already lost. Germany had already lost, not because of this gun or that tank or any single battle, because you couldn't win a war when your factories ran on terror and your workers prayed for liberation, because you couldn't build a 1,000-year empire on the foundation of fear, because the girl who hummed would always eventually outlast the guard with the gun. He'd known it at the arsenal, but now he felt it, and the feeling was unbearable. Klaus stopped working, stopped eating. The telegram stayed folded in his pocket, but he could feel its weight like lead, like evidence of every wrong choice he'd ever made. Mitchell left him alone for 2 days, understanding perhaps that some grief needed solitude, that some reckonings happened in silence. On the 3rd day, Mitchell found him sitting on the barrack steps in the late afternoon. The captain didn't announce himself, didn't offer empty comfort. He just sat down beside Klaus on the worn wood and stared out at the empty parade ground. They sat like that for maybe 10 minutes, 2 men who'd lost too much watching shadows lengthen across Mississippi dirt. Finally, Mitchell spoke. "I read Tommy's last letter last night, the one from Anzio, before." He paused, and Klaus could hear him breathing, could hear the effort it took to say the words. He wrote about a German medic. They'd captured a position, found this kid, Wehrmacht, maybe 19, gut wound, crying for his mother. Tommy said the German medic stayed with him, got captured on purpose, wouldn't leave, stayed until the kid died. Held his hand. Klaus closed his eyes. Thought of all the boys dying in fields far from home, calling for mothers who would never hear them. Tommy wrote. Mitchell continued, and his voice cracked slightly. "Dad, they're just kids. All of us. We're just kids in uniforms pretending we know what we're doing, and I don't know what we're fighting for anymore except to get home alive." The evening cicadas started their song. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine turned over, coughed, caught, life continuing, indifferent to grief. "I wanted to hate you," Mitchell said. "Every German in this camp, every soldier who wore that uniform. I wanted it to be simple. Enemy, other. Something I could put in a box and lock away." He turned the photograph of Tommy over in his hands, worn smooth from being touched too many times. "But it's not simple. It never was. You're just a man who wanted his son to come home. Same as me." Klaus felt something break inside him. Not loudly, just a quiet cracking like ice giving way. "I sent him there," he said. The words came out rough, scraped, raw. Hans wanted to study literature, poetry. He read Goethe and Rilke and wanted to be a teacher, but I pushed him. Said he needed to serve, to prove himself, to make me proud. And he went because I told him to, because I believed. Klaus pressed his palms against his eyes. "God help me," I believed. They sat in the gathering dusk. Hayes brought them coffee eventually, set the cups down without a word, and left them alone. The coffee grew cold while they sat. 2 fathers, 2 sons. The distance between them somehow smaller than the distance between who they'd been and who they were becoming. That night, Klaus lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the arsenal, about the girl humming, about systems built on trust instead of terror, about Hans somewhere in Russia, if he was still alive, fighting for a government that had bombed Klaus's home to rubble, about Tommy in a grave in Italy, dying for something his father still couldn't name. And Klaus made a decision. He found Mitchell in the workshop the next morning before anyone else arrived, placed a handwritten document on the table, 20 pages of detailed notes in his careful engineer's script, German defensive positions he'd heard about through prisoner networks, supply routes, railway schedules, engineering weaknesses in the by, Atlantic Wall fortifications, everything he knew or had heard or could reasonably deduce, everything that might help end this faster. Mitchell stared at the pages. "If your intelligence officers can use this to end the war faster," Klaus said, his voice steady now, purposeful, "then maybe fewer sons die. Yours, mine, all of them. This could be considered treason," Mitchell said quietly. "Yes." Klaus met his eyes. "But I'm not betraying my country. I'm trying to save what's left of it. The real Germany. The one that still knows how to build things. Not destroy them. The one that might survive this madness and become something worth saving." Mitchell looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the pages, folded them carefully, and put them in his jacket. "I'll make sure these get to the right people." A week later, Mitchell drove Klaus back to Rock Island Arsenal one final time. They stood on the observation deck again, watching the M1911 line run its relentless rhythm. The same workers, the same precision, the same girl Klaus had seen before, installing firing pins, stamping her initials, humming a tune he still didn't recognize. "You asked me once," Mitchell said, "what made me realize you couldn't win?" Klaus nodded. He remembered. It felt like a lifetime ago. "It wasn't the gun," Mitchell said. "It was her. That girl. You know why she stamps her initials on everyone?" Klaus shook his head. "Because she's proud of it. Because she knows her name will go to France with that pistol, and some lieutenant will use it to get home alive. She's not afraid of being shot if she makes a mistake. She's just trying to do good work." Mitchell handed Klaus the M1911 from his belt. "Your factories run on fear. Ours run on hope. That's the difference. That's why you couldn't win. Not because of the gun, because of who builds it." Klaus held the pistol, felt its weight, its balance, its brutal, simple honesty. A weapon built by free people who believed their work mattered, who signed their names to it, who hummed while they worked because tomorrow might be better than today. "You're right," Klaus said quietly. "When I saw this, the scale, the precision, the people, I knew. Not in my head, in my gut. We'd already lost. We just didn't know it yet." He looked at Mitchell. "Or maybe we did know. Maybe we always knew. We just couldn't admit it. Because admitting it meant admitting everything else. What we'd built, what we'd become, what we'd done in the name of strength and purity in a 1,000-year empire." They stood in silence, watching the assembly line run, chunk, chunk, chunk. The sound of inevitability, the sound of a system that worked because people wanted it to work, because they believed in it, because no one held guns to their heads. May 8th, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe ended on a Tuesday. Klaus stood in the camp yard with Mitchell and Hayes and hundreds of other prisoners, listening to the radio announcement. Around them, men wept, some in relief, some in despair, some in both at once. The Reich was gone, Hitler dead, Germany defeated. Everything Klaus had believed in, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed his son for, reduced to rubble and ash and guilty silence. Hayes appeared at Klaus's side, holding a telegram. Klaus's hands trembled as he opened it, the words blurred. He read them twice to make sure he understood. Hans Hartmann, Soviet custody, injured but alive, repatriation pending. Klaus dropped to his knees right there in the dirt. Mitchell's hand found his shoulder, steady, present. And Klaus wept, the kind of tears that empty you out and fill you back up simultaneously. Tears for his son who'd survived, for Tommy who hadn't, for all the boys who died believing the lies men like Klaus had told them, for the home that didn't exist anymore, for the country that had to rebuild itself from ashes and shame. "You get to go home," Mitchell said quietly, "both of you." "There's no home to go back to," Klaus said. The words came out broken. Mitchell pulled him to his feet. His grip was firm, solid, the grip of a man who'd learned how to carry grief and keep walking. "Then you build a new one," he said. "That's what we do, Doc. We build." And standing there in the Mississippi sun with the radio still playing victory music, holding a telegram that meant his son was alive, Klaus understood. Building was hope. Building was penance. Building was the only way forward. Not weapons this time, not machines of death, but something else, something better. Something that might justify the trust this American captain had shown him, the kindness that young corporal had offered, the mercy he'd never expected and didn't deserve. He would build, and maybe if he built well enough and long enough and honestly enough, some part of him might be redeemed. Some part of Germany might be redeemed. Some part of all of them. Hayes smiled at him through his own tears. "Welcome home, sir," he said. And Klaus realized the young man meant it, meant all of it. That home wasn't a place anymore. It was this, the choice to build instead of destroy, to hope instead of fear, to sign your name to your work and mean it.